the issue. Should we stop it now, and why? So Steve Running testified that each ton of greenhouse gases emitted in the atmosphere exacerbates the impacts to the climate. And that it's a scientific certainty that fossil fuel emissions, if they continue, the Earth will continue to warm. And I just want to stop right here. This is the first time a court had made these findings that I'm going to read to you about climate science after a trial. Regarding Kathy Whitlock's testimony, every ton of fossil fuel emissions contributes to global warming and impacts the climate. Projections essentially indicate that atmospheric CO2 and other greenhouse gases will increase the severity of all impacts. We also had experts testify. Again, remember, we have a youth, we have an expert, we have a youth, we have an expert. We had expert testify about shrinking glaciers and looked at glaciers in Glacier National Park. And essentially, you see the percentage lost of the glaciers, and this is essentially 2015 data, so it's worse, but you can see, if you can see the slide, it starts at 83% as the worst, but even the least affected back in 2015 was 45%. And then we had Pete Erickson testify. Pete's from Seattle, and what Pete does is he does greenhouse gas accounting. So he accounts for what's going on in various areas. Here, his testimony was on 3 areas. What is Montana's role on extraction, the transportation and processing of fossil fuels, and consumption? Oh, sorry, here. And he said, okay, the states come in here and said, Montana doesn't matter. What we do in Montana doesn't matter. It's kind of a variation of what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Pete was essentially countering the Montana defense that we're just a spit in the ocean. And what you, Judge Seeley, do, or if you order this, it won't matter because what we do in Montana doesn't matter. Well, you know what? Pete testified, this is an annual basis, 32 million tons of CO2 are consumed, 70 million are extracted in Montana, and 80 plus million are transported, various pipelines and the like. So the total emissions that Montana is responsible for, one way or the other, is 166 million. Well, how's this translate? Well, Montana's got a population of 1.1 million. It's equivalent to Argentina, Netherlands, Pakistan in terms of annual CO2 emissions. Let's talk about consumption. Just consumption, there's almost as much consumption of fossil fuels in Montana as in Ireland. Or transportation and processing, almost as much as, more than Colombia, that has 52 million people. But, so Pete then said, well, let's see what's happened since the Constitution was passed in Montana in 1972. So here's what Montana was responsible for in 1972, and here's what's happened since then. 3.7 billion metric tons of CO2. And for me, the most important slide, and by the way, when I'm showing you here, these were demonstratives we used during the trial. And so when I examined Pete, I said, well, so that's what's been extracted. What remains in Montana? And Pete says, well, look, there's 6 coal mines. Their annual production is 34 million short tons. There's reserves of over 700 million. Well, there's 4,000 oil wells. Well, there's reserves of 298 million barrels. And all that, do you see, 95% of that's exported. So, and then gas wells, there remains reserves of 613. And the reason this is compelling is, Judge Seeley, if you don't do something about this now, guess what is going to happen in the future? And it was very dramatic, laying not only as 166 million tons that Montana is already responsible for, but what is going to happen in the future if the state can disregard fossil fuel emissions. Then we have Mark Jacobson, professor at Stanford, an amazing guy who, essentially what Mark has done an amazing amount of work with throughout the world is, can you shift your state, your nation, whatever it is, from renewables, wind, water, solar, away from fossil fuels? And he says, okay, let's look at the way Montana was in 2018. 75% fossil fuels, bioenergy 4.2%. And wind, water, and solar are 21.2%. And can we shift to wind, water, and solar? And Mark said, absolutely. And so that by 2050, because that was the target we gave him, Montana could be at 100% of wind, water, and solar, essentially reducing fossil fuel emissions by over 61%. And I want to just quickly talk about how one of our plaintiffs, while she was in junior high, middle school, she raised the money so that the school could install a solar panel system. So what would that mean to Montana if it reduced its fossil fuel use? It would save the state essentially over $6.5 billion per year. And in Montana, that's, I mean, that might not mean as much in California, but the savings in California are just as dramatic. But imagine in Montana, where there aren't a lot of people who live in Montana with a lot of money. I mean, they all fly in to Bozeman and go skiing, but it's $2.8 billion. Also, we had the testimony of Ann Hedges, and I'm going to need a little bit more time than that, sorry. And that the state has known that, for dangerous impacts of greenhouse gas emissions for at least 30 years. And that the state, and these all quotes are all from Judge Seeley's order, the state's actions exacerbate the climate crisis and cause future harms to Montana's environment and its citizens, especially its youth. Now the state only put on 3 witnesses. One, the head of its Department of Environmental Quality, another employee of the state. And essentially what they said is, we just do what the legislature says. So if the legislature says don't consider fossil fuel emissions, we're not going to consider it. If we're ordered to consider fossil fuel emissions, we'll consider it. And then they had an economist, Terry Anderson from the Hoover Institute over here at Stanford, and the judge found him not to be credible at all. Okay? Anyways, and so she came out on August 14 with her order, and she determined that the statutes that I referenced are unconstitutional and permanently enjoined, permanently stopped. And she also determined that, she also enjoined the state from taking any action, including ignoring consideration of greenhouse gas emissions and climate change. So what are the next steps in the case? Well, on September 18, Judge Seeley certified the case for interlocutory appeal, which means it could go up before the Montana Supreme Court. And on September 28, her order was appealed to the Montana Supreme Court. So the issue is, will the Montana Supreme Court take our case? We firmly believe that it will, and that the briefs will occur over the next 60 to 120 days, and hopefully we'll be arguing the case before the Montana Supreme Court in the April timeframe. What's happened to the case internationally? I've talked about the case, a lot of people have talked about this case, and it's had press coverage, an incredible amount of press coverage. I did a seminar on the case in Japan, and there was an article about the case. These are the state's lawyers, these are the plaintiffs walking into the courtroom. The New York Times just had a special section that featured our Hawaii case and the Held case. That was on September 24. And the point is, it's really been dramatic, the impacts of the case. Because Judge Seeley's ruling is the first legal opinion of its kind spelling out environmental harms caused by greenhouse gas emissions and the effects of climate change on the physical and mental health of youth. Her 103-page order correlates greenhouse gas emissions and changes to the environment. And retired Supreme Court Justice Jim Nelson, Montana Supreme Court Justice Jim Nelson, called the case a slam dunk home run and said that the biggest implication was that climate change is now covered by the clean and healthful environment provision in the Constitution. Michael Gerard of Columbia Law School's Sabin Center characterized her opinion as the strongest decision on climate change ever issued by any court. And that's what he does for a living, is he analyzes litigation regarding climate change. The court resoundingly affirmed what the climate scientists are saying, and it will become even harder to attack basic climate scientists in the court where facts matter. And then another legal scholar, Garrett Epps, wrote, while the state will undoubtedly appeal, this victory is a breakthrough for climate litigation. So there's a right to clean and healthful environment. It's in many countries, but it's not explicitly, obviously, in our Constitution, and I can talk later on about that. The Constitutions of Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, Hawaii, and New York contain versions of Montana's language, and there's movements to have green amendments on the ballot primarily in 2024. And but the issue with the Held lawsuit is, we all know, lawsuits are not the best way to make policy. In an ideal world, our elected officials would be dealing with what the scientific evidence says, but that's not happening. And one of the things people say is, well, why can't the people who object or are going to be affected vote these legislators out? Well, youth can't vote. So Held allows us to imagine a time when governments stop promoting fossil fuel use and curb greenhouse gas emissions. And because of the Held decision, this future's become a little more possible. And when we began these cases, there were a lot of legal scholars, practicing attorneys, national environmental groups who said that the youth will never succeed in a case like this. And Held suddenly made that dream a reality. Our next trial's in Hawaii in June of 2024. These are the plaintiffs in the Hawaii case. As I said, our Children's Trust does the work here. So if you want to look up our Children's Trust, there's the website. Here's the QR code that I wouldn't know what to do with. You can get on the mailing list, social media, or visit the website. And I want to thank you all very much.